There are very few book to television or movie adaptations that are able to perfectly capture an author's original vision. Lord of the Rings is probably one example. The Last Airbender is probably another. But I can successfully say, now that I have watched the last episode of Netflix's adaptation of Neil Gaiman's Sandman comics, that this show absolutely understands what made the original comics great, and not only adapts Gaiman's original vision almost perfectly, but oftentimes manages to improve upon it. I had a very good feeling about this adaptation from the beginning. One of the main reasons being that Gaiman himself is so heavily involved in the production and has been talking about it for years at this point, and hyping it up and reassuring fans that it is going to be a faithful adaptation. So I had high expectations going in, and somehow the show managed to surpass all of them. It takes the source material and adapts it almost word for word in many scenes, but then it also somehow manages to surprise readers of the original comics, of which I am one, with outstanding visuals and also small changes to the plot that are subtle but very effective and get Gaiman's point across even more effectively than in the original comics. When Neil Gaiman first started writing the Sandman comics, it was the late 80s, and he was still very much kind of an unknown figure, nothing like the juggernaut that he is today. The first issues of the Sandman comics, they sowed the seeds for everything that was to come, but they're often considered the weakest parts of the series. Gaiman was still trying to figure out what these comics were really fundamentally going to be about. At first, if you read just the first 6 or 7 issues, it seems very much like a horror comic series, but that changes fundamentally as the series goes on, and it really starts to encompass every genre. But what this show manages to do is take these early issues of the series and retain the horror elements, but also bring a certain sense of humanity that is fundamental to the series in later issues. Well, from the very beginning too, but especially in later issues as he matures as a writer. The show fleshes out characters who were somewhat caricaturized in the early issues. An example, not getting into spoilers just yet, but an example is one of the main villains of season 1, John Dee, who in the comics he's a really mostly completely unsympathetic Joker type character, whereas in the show the actor who plays John Dee brings a lot more to the character, and you get the sense that he thinks that what he's doing is actually genuinely to help people, which was really impressive and really incredible. The casting as a whole in this series is one of the main reasons I think it works so well. With a lot of these characters, they're so iconic and they have such distinct personalities that the wrong casting could totally make the whole series fall apart, especially for main characters like Dream and Death. But I can safely say that all of the casting was perfectly spot on, and many of the actors looked and talked like they had jumped right out of the comic book pages. I still remember the first time I heard Tom Sturridge, who plays Dream, speak in an interview several months ago about the Sandman, and I was astounded that they had somehow managed to find this person who looks and talks exactly like how I imagine Dream in the comics to look and talk. It's quite a remarkable feat. But getting on into what this series is about, if you're not familiar with the comics, it's really difficult to explain what the Sandman is actually about, and I find myself fumbling every time I try to do it, because every episode of this show, just like every issue in the comic series, is completely different from every other one. It crosses through a lot of different genres, it explores a lot of different characters, and a lot of different time periods. So if you like anthology type stories where you never really know what you're going to get with a new episode, but there is still a very strong underlying narrative that is not just building up to a big climax at the end of this season, but is also, because of how accurate this is, I can already say this pretty much with 100% certainty, is building up to a major climax at the end of season 4 or season 5 or however many seasons there are going to be, then I definitely recommend this show. You have to have a certain degree of confidence in the showrunners in order for this to work effectively. And this is also very much the case in the comics. You have to have a lot of confidence in Neil Gaiman to allow yourself to just be whisked off to a bunch of different locales. But once you kind of allow them that power, there's nothing else quite like it. And I also want to take a moment to just dwell on the visuals, because visually speaking, this is one of the most impressive television shows I think I've ever seen. Oftentimes, panels from the comic books that just seem like they would be impossible to put into live action, to the extent that a lot of fans were calling actually for an animated adaptation prior to the release of this, or prior to when they started making this series. A lot of these panels are just brought to life verbatim in the show in a way that just leaves me astounded. So I think the CG team deserves a lot of credit for what they've managed to accomplish here. There's a strong element of surrealism to the series that almost reminds me of Doctor Strange in its better moments, not narratively, just visually speaking. And it really just effectively translates the abstract nature of the comic book medium to a cinematic format, and even expands on the surrealism in the comics by messing with your sense of perspective and your sense of gravity. All these kind of laws about the world that break down in dreams also break down in the visuals of this show. So I want to talk briefly a little bit about spoilers, but if you are unfamiliar with the Sandman comics and this sounds like something you'd be interested in, then I absolutely 100% recommend it. Please go to Netflix and watch it, because we need as many people watching it in order to get a season 2, because we know how Netflix is when it comes to canceling shows. So for the sake of all the fans, I encourage you to check this out. But getting on into spoilers, I think almost all of the changes this series made from the comics were really justified and really effective. The decision to have the 24 hours diner sequence be less focused on the horror elements and more focused on the humanity of the main characters, I was a little unsure about at first, because that issue of the comic book is so stuck in my head as being like this masterpiece of horror, and just honestly being one of the most terrifying short stories I've ever read. But I think it was absolutely the right decision, because going back and looking at the comic again, I just see that, as I was saying earlier, there isn't the same nuance to the character of John Dee and to a lot of the other characters. I think that by having this slow build-up instead of this kind of stochastic narration that we see in the comic book, I think that was a really effective way to translate this episode into television. My only real reservation is that this episode did not really convey the sense of time passing as well as in the comic book. In the comic book, it's very clear that these people have been stuck in the diner for a really long time, which is not as effectively communicated, I think, in the show, but I think that was kind of a necessary sacrifice for the changes they make, so I understand it. And a lot of the other changes, like cutting out minor DC characters who made cameos, like Martian Manhunter and the Scarecrow, I totally get why they made that decision. I honestly don't miss them. I don't think Neil Gaiman probably would have put them in if he had written these comics at a later stage in his career. Sorry, Martian Manhunter fans. The choice to have John Constantine replaced by Joanna Constantine was fantastic, and I love Jenna Coleman in that role. Some of the most major changes happened during the Doll's House storyline, with everything that went on with Lyta Hall and Jed and how that all played out. Probably episode 8, I believe it was, had the most changes compared to the comics. But again, I think all those changes made sense, and one of the things I was a little bit worried about going in was that allocating 4 episodes for the Doll's House storyline wouldn't really be enough, but they actually managed to streamline that story really well. And I'm really impressed with how they did that. One of the only changes that I have small, minor reservations about is the way that Dream actually gets captured in the first episode, because in the comics, it's very clear that Dream, when he gets captured, is in a weakened state. There's an explanation for why Roderick Burgess, who's just really some random magician and not, not nearly as powerful as one of the Endless, is able to capture him. And that ties into the prequel, sort of a prequel, kind of a sequel-ish to the Sandman, which is Sandman Overture. But in the show, they didn't show Dream in his weakened state returning from a distant galaxy. That was the setting of Overture. Instead, they just kind of had him confront the Corinthian in Berlin and then get captured immediately after that, which, I don't know, I thought that was a little bit strange, especially considering that Gaiman has said that he wants to adapt Overture. That seems like that would be a good opportunity to include a little bit of foreshadowing to that storyline, or backshadowing since it's a prequel, whatever. But for the most part, I think the changes they made from the comics were all completely within the spirit of the story, and I feel like I'm being extremely positive and not really giving that many criticisms of this show, but that's because I genuinely think this show, I don't have that much to criticize. I've heard some people say that because it's so similar to the comics, it's a little bit boring to watch. Personally, I didn't find that. Even though the dialogue is adapted verbatim from the comics, if you really are a big fan of the comics, then I think just seeing a lot of these scenes, in motion and in the gorgeous visuals of this medium played by these really talented actors, I think that's satisfying enough in and of itself. I've also, this is a less accurate adaptation than the Audible audiobook adaptation that has been coming out for the past couple years, and I've also really enjoyed listening to that, even though that adaptation is literally just an audiobook version of the original comics, but with a full cast. As I was saying, though, there are still enough changes that it is unexpected and fun to watch. Actually, one of the changes that Neil Gaiman said specifically was put in there to throw off fans of the original comics was that John Dee did not kill Rosemary, which is, I thought that was a really interesting choice and added a lot to his character, but it also showed me like, oh, yeah, I don't know everything that's going to happen in this show. There are going to be some things that are unexpected. As a matter of fact, this series has almost served as kind of an update for me in terms of my opinions about adaptations in general, because in the past I have been sometimes somewhat indifferent to adaptations of my favorite books. For example, Brandon Sanderson has been talking a lot about adaptations of his books recently, and I haven't been sure how I would feel about that, because I feel like the books are already there. I enjoy them. I'm not sure it really needs to be translated into another medium. But now that I've seen what can be done when an author's vision is so accurately ferried into another medium, I'm really excited about seeing other authors' works adapted into television, because it's not just satisfying to watch, it's really exciting to watch. So yes, I have tremendously enjoyed watching this show, and I just hope, fingers crossed, that we get all of the Sandman stories adapted and for television, however many seasons that takes, because I think it's a story that deserves to be appreciated by even wider audiences than it already is appreciated by. So yeah, that wraps up my review. Thanks for watching so much. Like and subscribe if you want to, and yeah, keep an eye out for more fantasy and book related content coming soon.